The call came in, another vague report of a suspicious black man. Officers Jake Reynolds and Ryan Harris didn't care if it was real or not. They never did. They had made careers out of profiling, escalating, and brutalizing without consequence. When they arrived, they found Jamal Carter and his son, Darnell, unarmed, innocent, simply celebrating a hard-earned success. But the officers weren't interested in explanations. They were looking for control. And when Darnell reached down for his phone, the bullets started flying. They expected the story to end there. Another name lost. Another case buried beneath excuses and red tape. But Jamal Carter wasn't going to let that happen. He was Delta Force, a soldier, a man who had spent his life in war zones. Jamal Carter wasn't going to grieve quietly. He wasn't going to let them decide how this ended. One way or another, justice will be served. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The sky stretched overhead, soft and warm with the fading hues of evening, the kind of peaceful dusk that seemed to promise nothing but serenity. The rental house stood quiet, nestled within a pristine suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges and front porches bore the glow of gentle lanterns. It wasn't home, but for a few days, it would be a well-earned escape to celebrate something that, for a father like Jamal Carter, meant more than words could ever say. Inside, the air carried the rich scent of grilled steak and roasted vegetables, a feast prepared with careful hands, one befitting the occasion. Darnell sat at the dining table, a broad smile on his face as he laughed at something his father had just said, his eyes gleaming with the kind of pride and joy that only came with a victory long fought for. He had done it. After years of sleepless nights, grueling study sessions, and endless sacrifices, he had finally graduated from medical school, stepping into the future with a white coat and a promise to make the world better than the one he had grown up in. Jamal watched his son, the warmth in his chest something deep, something unshakable. He had spent a lifetime protecting people, serving in places where danger lurked around every corner, where death was never more than a breath away. Yet no battlefield had ever held the weight of this moment. Seeing his boy become a man who would heal instead of harm, build instead of destroy. There were no words for how proud he was, but there was something else, something he had been waiting to give Darnell. Something that couldn't be put into words, but needed to be felt. "I got something for you," Jamal said, standing up and stretching, his movements slow, deliberate. Darnell raised a brow, curiosity flickering across his face. "Yeah? What is it?" Jamal chuckled, shaking his head. "Not yet. I left it in the car. Stay here. Finish eating." Darnell smirked, shaking his head. Always with the dramatics. Jamal gave him a look, one that said, "Trust me," before heading toward the front door. The evening air met him with a crisp coolness as he stepped outside, the sound of crickets humming beneath the faint rustle of trees swaying in the breeze. The street was quiet, undisturbed, the kind of neighborhood where people went to bed early, secure in the belief that nothing bad ever happened here. He walked toward the rental car, glancing over his shoulder once to make sure Darnell wasn't watching, wanting to keep the surprise intact. His hands slipped into his pockets as he approached the vehicle, his posture relaxed, unaware that beyond the windows of a house across the street, unseen eyes were watching him. The woman on the other end of the line kept her voice low as she spoke into the phone, her fingers tightening around the cordless receiver. "Yes, I don't know. It just looks suspicious. He's lurking around the car, looking around like he's checking if anyone's watching." A pause. "No, I don't think he lives here. I've never seen him before." Another pause. Yes. I'll stay inside." The dispatcher's voice remained calm, collected, assuring her that officers would be sent to check it out. Jamal, oblivious to the call, opened the car door, reaching inside to retrieve a small, elegantly wrapped box. A gift, something that held meaning far beyond its material worth. The moment was small, simple, yet, in the grand scheme of his life, it was a moment he would cling to, a moment before everything changed. As he closed the car door and turned back toward the house, he had no way of knowing that somewhere in the distance, squad cars were already moving, their sirens off, but their presence looming like a storm waiting to break. He walked back up the steps, stepping into the warmth of the house once more, where Darnell was still seated, a fork halfway to his mouth as he glanced up. Jamal smirked, lifting the box. "Told you I had something for you." Darnell's brow furrowed as he set his fork down. "What is it? Open it and see." The younger man reached forward, his fingers brushing against the sleek wrapping before carefully peeling it away, his eyes narrowing in confusion before realization dawned. He let out a breath, shaking his head with something between awe and gratitude. "Dad, this is—" Before he could finish, a flicker of red and blue lights flashed through the window, the soft hum of idling engines creeping into the night. The air shifted, the easy warmth of the evening fading into something tense, something cold. Jamal turned his head toward the window, the glow of headlights cutting through the dusk. The quiet had been broken, replaced by the unmistakable presence of law enforcement. Darnell's face twisted in confusion. "What's going on?" Jamal exhaled slowly, his hands resting at his sides, shoulders squared. "I don't know." A voice rang out from beyond the door, sharp and authoritative. "This is the police. Step outside with your hands where we can see them." Darnell shot his father a bewildered look, rising from his seat. "What the hell?" Jamal clenched his jaw, his body already moving, not with fear, but with a slow, deliberate kind of caution that came from experience. He knew this dance, knew the way it played out, the way these situations had a way of twisting into something dark, something irreversible. He reached for the doorknob, pausing for the briefest moment before glancing at his son. "Stay calm," he murmured. "No sudden moves." Darnell nodded, though confusion still clouded his features. Jamal opened the door, stepping onto the porch with his son beside him, his eyes scanning the 4 officers standing in formation near their squad cars, hands hovering over their weapons. The street, once quiet, now held an eerie stillness, a silence so sharp it felt like the entire world was waiting to see how this moment would unfold. The lead officer stepped forward, his stance firm. "We got a call about suspicious activity in this residence. You need to identify yourselves." Jamal's gaze hardened, his fists clenching at his sides. The injustice of it hit him like a gut punch, the bitter taste of reality settling on his tongue. This wasn't new. It wasn't surprising. It was just another day of being seen as a threat, before being seen as a man. Beside him, Darnell glanced between his father and the officers, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. Jamal's voice came low, controlled, but edged with something unyielding. "This is our house. We rented it. My son just graduated, and we're celebrating. That a crime now?" The officer's fingers twitched near his holster, his posture stiffening. "You need to cooperate." Jamal didn't move, his stance firm, unshaken. Darnell's voice was calm but laced with frustration. "Look, we don't want trouble. We can clear this up." The officer's voice hardened. "We're not going to ask again. Hands up, both of you." Jamal exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, every instinct screaming at him to stand his ground. He had spent his life fighting battles overseas, defending freedom, protecting lives, and yet here he stood, on his own soil, treated as a threat for merely existing. Darnell, wary, glanced between his father and the officers, sensing the tension thickening, feeling the moment inching toward something dangerous. Jamal's muscles tensed, and the night hung heavy with the danger neither of them could yet see coming. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man whose name tag read Harris, shifted his weight forward, his voice carrying the kind of manufactured authority that didn't invite questions. "We got a call about suspicious activity in this house. You need to identify yourselves." Jamal exhaled, slow and measured, forcing himself to keep his voice steady, despite the irritation simmering beneath his skin. "We already told you. This is our place. We rented it for a few days. Out here on vacation. My son just graduated." We were celebrating inside until you all showed up. His hand lifted slightly, gesturing toward the doorway. You can see for yourself. Dinner's still on the table. Harris didn't move, his gaze unreadable beneath the shadow of his cap. The neon glow of the patrol car reflecting off the metal badge pinned to his chest. His fingers flexed near his holster. A slight movement, but one Jamal's trained eyes didn't miss. Your names. Harris's voice remained cold, impersonal, as if he hadn't heard a word. Jamal clenched his jaw, but Darnell, ever the peacemaker, stepped in. I'm Darnell Carter. This is my father, Jamal. We're from Georgia. We just got here yesterday. His hands remained open at his sides, non-threatening. The house was booked online. I can show you the confirmation. Harris gave a sharp nod to one of the officers standing beside him, a younger man with a stiff stance and nervous energy radiating from him. Officer Reynolds. Jamal caught from the name stitched onto his uniform. The rookie, trigger-happy, eager to prove himself. You say you rented it? Harris continued, skepticism laced in his tone. Mind telling me why we got a report of someone creeping around the property? Jamal let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head as his hands went to his hips, exasperation clear in the slow rise and fall of his chest. So that's what this is about? Someone saw a black man walk to his own damn car and decided to call the cops? Darnell cast him a look, careful. But Jamal couldn't help it. The frustration was rising now, coiling in his gut like a snake waiting to strike. He'd spent decades of his life in uniform, following orders, protecting people, risking everything for a country that still saw him as a threat. Harris didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the irony of the situation. We don't know what's going on here yet. That's why we're asking questions. Jamal's patience thinned further. You're not asking questions. You're assuming. He motioned between himself and Darnell, his voice tightening. You see two black men in a nice house, and instead of thinking we might belong here, your first instinct is that we're criminals, like we broke in, like we're robbing the place. That's what you're thinking, isn't it? Harris didn't respond immediately, his gaze flicking between the two men, searching for something. What, exactly? Jamal couldn't tell, but he knew the look. Had seen it too many damn times before. It was the look of someone trying to rationalize their prejudice, to fit what they were seeing into the narrative already built in their head. Reynolds shifted beside him, eyes darting toward Harris, then back at Jamal. We need you both to step off the porch, he said, his voice tighter than his superior's, and put your hands where we can see them. Darnell blinked, his expression tightening in disbelief. Step off the porch? For what? What are we being accused of? Harris didn't answer. Instead, his voice dropped, colder this time, more forceful. Hands up. Now! Jamal's body tensed, but he stayed rooted in place. We're not under arrest. You have no reason to be treating us like criminals. This is harassment. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Harris snapped, his patience wearing thin. Step down. Hands on your head. Darnell let out a slow breath, his chest rising and falling in measured control. He turned to his father, lowering his voice. Dad, let's just do what they're asking. Jamal's jaw clenched. No, he said firmly, his voice unwavering. Darnell swallowed, glancing nervously between him and the officers, clearly aware of how quickly this could go south. We don't have to escalate this. Let's just comply. Let them check whatever they need to check, and we'll be done. Jamal turned his eyes back to Harris, his voice even but heavy with the weight of his years of service, of his deep, relentless exhaustion. I served this country, fought for it, bled for it. I don't answer to men who come knocking at my door, treating me like a suspect, before they even know my name. Harris stepped forward, jaw tight. That's real touching, but it doesn't change the fact that we got a report, and we're not leaving until we confirm this house isn't being burglarized. Jamal scoffed, shaking his head. You've got our names. You know we're supposed to be here. What else do you need? Reynolds's hand hovered near his holster, his knuckles white. Last warning. Darnell let out a breath, his shoulders tense, his hands slowly rising. Not high, but enough to be visible. Dad, he said quietly, I'll show them the booking confirmation on my phone. That should be enough. The movement was small, harmless, just a reflex as he reached down toward his pocket. But in an instant, the street erupted with panicked shouting. "Don't move! Hands up! Hands up! Drop it!" Jamal barely had time to react before the moment tipped past the point of no return. Reynolds's hand flew to his gun, and the night, once still, once calm, exploded in gunfire. Jamal saw it before his mind could process it, before his body could react, before his voice could force its way past his throat. One moment, Darnell was standing beside him, his hands barely moving, his mouth parting to speak, to explain. Then his body jerked back, arms flinching up, his face contorting with something that wasn't pain yet. Not fully, just the raw, stunned realization that something was wrong. The first bullet hit, then the second, then the third, and his knees buckled beneath him, the force driving him down, as though the earth itself had opened up to swallow him whole. Jamal moved without thinking. His training had drilled reaction over hesitation, but this was something else, something primal, something unstoppable. His feet were already moving, his arms reaching, his instincts overriding everything else, because there was no future if he didn't get to his boy. Darnell's body crumpled onto the pavement, his breath coming in quick, sharp gasps, his fingers twitching, grabbing at the air, at nothing at all. His eyes were wide, wild with confusion, his mouth opening like he wanted to say something, but the words weren't there yet. Just the effort, just the struggle. Jamal was on his knees before the hurt even registered, before the thick, dark pool beneath his son's body became something real. His arms wrapped around him, strong but trembling, hands pressing against his chest, desperate, trying to stop it, slow it, fix it, but the warmth spilled between his fingers, thick and relentless, seeping into his skin, into his soul. "Darnell," Jamal's voice cracked, breathless, his pulse roaring in his ears, drowning out everything else. The officers yelling, the distant wails of sirens, the panicked voices from shadowed porches. None of it mattered. "Son, look at me. I got you, okay?" Darnell coughed, his breath hitching, his lips stained red, his eyes locked onto his father's, something pleading in them, something terrified. His chest hitched unevenly, his hands weakly pressing against his father's arms, as if he could hold on. Just a little longer. Jamal's hands shook, pressing down harder, trying to stop what couldn't be stopped. "Hold on. You hear me? Just hold on. Help is coming." He wasn't even sure if he was lying. He didn't know if there was time, if anything could be done, but he had to say it. He had to believe it. Darnell's breathing hitched again, shallow and unsteady, his fingers tightening around his father's arm for the briefest second before weakening again. He swallowed hard, his lips parting, struggling for air, for words. "Dad." His voice was barely above a whisper, fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. His expression twisted, not in pain, but something worse. Regret. "I just wanted to help people." Jamal's throat closed, the weight of those words slamming into him harder than any force he had ever faced. His grip tightened around his son, his forehead pressing against Darnell's. "You did," he whispered, his voice thick, raw. "You did, son. You hear me? You're gonna help so many people. You're gonna be fine." Darnell's chest stuttered beneath his hands, his fingers curled into his father's sleeve, holding on, fighting. Then his grip loosened, his body sagged against Jamal's, the tension leaving him, the breath fading, the light behind his eyes flickering once, then gone. Jamal's world collapsed. For a second, he just held him, his chest rising and falling in unsteady, ragged gasps, his fingers trembling against cooling skin, his mind rejecting it, denying it, refusing to believe it. His son, his baby boy, had been alive a second ago. He was supposed to have a future, supposed to be a doctor, supposed to walk across a stage and shake hands and be somebody. He wasn't supposed to die in the street like this. Jamal's breath stilled. His hands, blood-soaked and shaking, curled into fists. The world had turned silent. Jamal knelt in the pool of his son's blood, his hands trembling, his breath uneven, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. Darnell's body was still warm, his weight heavy in Jamal's arms, but his chest no longer rose, his fingers no longer twitched, his eyes no longer held the spark of life that had been there just moments ago. The night still carried the echo of the gunfire that had torn his son away, but it felt distant now, a hollow sound that no longer belonged to this moment, to this world where Darnell was gone. Then the silence shattered. "Step away from the body! Hands where we can see them!" Jamal didn't move. "Now! Get on the ground!" Footsteps pounded against pavement, boots moving in fast, heavy strides, coming toward him, circling, preparing to take him down. "Do it now! Hands up! Hands up!" Jamal lifted his head, slowly, deliberately, his breath steady, controlled, his mind burning with something deeper than rage, something colder, more final. He could see it in their faces now. They knew. They knew they had fired too quickly. They knew they had acted on instinct, not reason. They knew there had been no threat, that Darnell had never reached for anything but his phone, that he had been unarmed, that they had taken an innocent life, and now they were trying to contain it, trying to control him, trying to erase what they had done. "You're under arrest! Get down on your knees!" Jamal's fingers curled against Darnell's lifeless form, his breath slowing, his mind shifting. They had no right to speak, no right to breathe. Not after what they had done. They were coming closer. "Hands behind your head! Do not resist!" One step closer, another. Then a hand reached for him. Jamal moved. His body exploded into motion, a force of pure, unrelenting violence, his grief and fury manifesting into something unstoppable. He spun, his hands snapping up with lightning-fast precision, grabbing the officer's outstretched wrist and twisting hard. A sharp, sickening pop filled the air as the man screamed, his gun falling from his grip, clattering onto the pavement. "Ugh!" Before the officer could stumble back, Jamal's elbow drove into his throat, crushing off his air. The man fell, choking, gasping, his body curling inward as he clawed at his own neck. The second officer moved, his gun still raised, but Jamal was faster. With a swift, powerful lunge, he closed the distance, grabbing the man's wrist and jerking his arm upward, forcing the weapon to point harmlessly toward the sky. The officer tried to yank free, but Jamal's other hand shot forward, driving into his ribs with a brutal force that sent him reeling backward. The man barely had time to gasp before Jamal followed through, grabbing his uniform and throwing him hard onto the pavement, his back slamming into the ground with a heavy thud. Jamal didn't stop. He dropped down on top of him, fists driving into his face, into his ribs, into any open target. Each blow landed with bone-breaking force. The weight of everything they had stolen from him, everything they had taken, everything they had destroyed, pouring into every strike. The officer grunted, gasped, choked, his hands scrambling to shield himself, but Jamal was relentless, his vision blurred with rage, his muscles burned, but he kept hitting, kept breaking, kept making sure they felt every ounce of his pain. The first officer, still writhing from his dislocated wrist and crushed throat, tried to crawl away, tried to reach for his gun, but Jamal's head snapped toward him. "No, you don't!" He was on him in seconds, his foot slamming down onto the officer's arm, pinning him in place. The man yelped, his whole body trembling beneath the pressure, his eyes wide with something that hadn't been there before. Fear. Jamal knelt down, grabbing the officer by the collar and yanking him up, forcing him to look into his eyes, the same eyes he had looked into when he'd pulled the trigger. "Look at me!" The officer struggled, panting, his breath wheezing, his body shaking beneath Jamal's grip. Jamal's hands tightened. He could feel the man's pulse hammering beneath his fingertips, the sheer terror radiating from his trembling frame, the way his entire body seized up, frozen in the realization that he had made a mistake that he could never take back. Jamal could end him right now. Every muscle in his body screamed for it, begged for it, demanded justice in the only way the world had ever shown him was possible. The officer shuddered, his lips trembling, his face pale beneath the red and blue haze of the patrol lights. And Jamal? Jamal didn't blink. He saw Darnell in his mind, his son lying there, his son staring up at him with wide, confused eyes, struggling to breathe, whispering his last words, just wanting to help people. Jamal's jaw clenched, his body locked. He didn't deserve the mercy of a quick death. Slowly, he let go. The officer collapsed onto the ground, coughing, gasping, too broken to move, too terrified to fight back. Jamal stood there, his body trembling with unchecked fury, his breath coming slow and heavy, his fists still curled, his knuckles bloodied, though none of it was his own. The street was silent again, but this time it wasn't the peaceful stillness of the night. It was something thick, suffocating, the kind of quiet that came after something irreversible, after something had been broken that could never be repaired. Jamal knelt beside his son, his fingers brushing lightly against Darnell's cheek, his mind rejecting the truth his body already knew. His boy was gone. The warmth was fading too fast, slipping from his skin, leaving only the husk of what once held a future, a dream, a life full of promise. Behind him, the two officers, Reynolds and Harris, lay sprawled on the pavement, broken, gasping, too shattered to move. Reynolds still clutched his throat, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven breaths, his eyes wide with shock, his face twisted with a mixture of pain and something else. Fear. Not just the fear of the man who had beaten him down, but of the consequences of what he had done. Harris groaned beside him, his dislocated wrist cradled weakly against his chest, his other hand pressing against his ribs, his breath coming in short, pained grunts. He had tried to roll onto his side, but the searing pain of Jamal's strikes had left him paralyzed, unable to do more than lay there and accept what had been done to him. They had killed a man's son, and in return, the father had made them pay. Jamal didn't spare them a glance. They weren't worth it. He turned back to Darnell, brushing his fingers against his son's bloodied shirt, his throat tightening, his body still trembling from the fight, from the loss, from everything. Then, sirens, louder this time, closer. The distant hum of engines turned into a roar, tires screeching, shadows spilling onto the pavement as squad cars flooded the street, their lights flashing wildly, illuminating the wreckage of what had unfolded. Boots hit the ground, fast, heavy, too many of them. Jamal still didn't move, not even as the officers stormed toward him, their voices sharp, their guns raised, the air filling with the chaotic bark of commands. On the ground! Hands behind your back! Nothing. Now! His fingers tightened slightly around Darnell's shirt, as if he could hold on to him just a little longer, as if he could anchor himself to this moment before they ripped it away. The first officer reached him, a violent yank at his shoulder, a hard pull, dragging him backward. Jamal barely registered the hit before he was slammed face first onto the pavement, his body crashing onto the unforgiving ground with brutal force. His breath tore from his lungs, a sharp burst of air leaving him as knees pressed into his back, into his spine, into his ribs, crushing down with full weight. Stop moving! Stop resisting! He wasn't moving. He wasn't resisting. But that didn't matter. A heavy fist drove into his ribs, not as a restraint, but as a punishment. A savage reminder of power. His vision blurred for a second, pain exploding through his side, his entire body locking up from the sheer force of the impact. Another hit, this time to his shoulder, A baton slammed against him with a sickening crack, a sharp pain radiating down his arm. Another, his leg. A sharp blow to the thigh, meant to weaken, meant to break. Then came the taser. A sharp, electric snap filled the air. And then, agony. 1,000 volts tore through his nerves, his muscles seizing violently, locking up against his will. His body arched against the pavement, his jaw clenched so tight, his teeth ground against each other, his breath caught in his throat. The pain was unbearable, but he refused to scream. Another surge, longer this time. More brutal, his limbs jerked, spasming uncontrollably, his mind flashing white-hot, every fiber of his being burning. Then, suddenly, it stopped. His body collapsed against the pavement, his muscles still twitching from the aftershock, his breaths shallow, uneven. The world blurred in flashes of red and blue, of boots, of bodies, of cold, unrelenting steel tightening around his wrists. The cuffs locked. The weight on his back finally lifted, but it didn't matter anymore. Hands gripped his arms, yanking him up. His legs barely held him, but they didn't care. They dragged him toward the patrol car, his body still buzzing with pain, his chest heaving, but his expression empty, hollow, silent. From the ground, Reynolds and Harris lay watching. Jamal met their gazes just once, his own eyes calm, cold, unyielding, and they looked away first. The camera shutters flashed. A crowd had gathered. Neighbors stood on porches, phones recording, eyes wide in horror, in disbelief, in recognition. The world was already watching. Jamal Carter wasn't just a grieving father anymore. He was a story, a headline, a moment in history that had just begun. The door slammed behind him, and the world outside blurred. The walls of the holding cell pressed in around him, cold and unyielding. The dim overhead light casting long shadows across the stained concrete floor. The air smelled of sweat and steel, of old rage and forgotten men, a scent that clung to the very walls, soaked into the bars, like something that had long since accepted its own permanence. Jamal sat on the narrow bench, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, his body still aching from the relentless assault, but his mind sharper than it had ever been. The pain didn't matter. The bruises, the cracked ribs, the deep throb in his limbs where the baton had struck, none of it compared to the raw, gaping wound that had been torn into him the moment his son's body went still. That pain was beyond the physical. That pain would never fade. The station outside was alive with movement, with voices, with the sharp clatter of boots and the hum of distant conversations. The world had not stopped moving, even though his had ended. Then, the door swung open. Heavy footfalls echoed through the small room before the sharp, deliberate click of the cell lock being disengaged rang out, the sound slicing through the stale air like a blade. Jamal didn't look up. He already knew who it was. Harris and Reynolds. The two officers he had left broken on the pavement now stood in front of him, their bodies tense, their uniforms disheveled, bruises forming across their faces, shadows of pain etched into their expressions. They weren't here as enforcers of the law. They were here for revenge. Harris stepped forward first, his left arm still held close to his body, his wrist wrapped in thick medical tape, his face a mask of barely contained fury. His voice was low, sharp, filled with a venom that he no longer had to mask behind the pretense of duty. "You think this is over?" His breath was uneven, the pain still lingering in his ribs where Jamal's fists had landed. "You think you walk out of here after what you did?" Jamal didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even blink. Reynolds exhaled sharply, his voice raw, his throat still bruised from the force that had crushed it. "You humiliated us," he growled, his words thick with resentment, his posture rigid with barely restrained rage. "In front of everyone. You made us look weak." Jamal tilted his head slightly, slowly, deliberately, his gaze finally lifting to meet theirs. His eyes, dark, steady, unmoved, held no fear. "You are weak." The words were like a slap, cutting through the small space between them, delivered without hesitation, without emotion, without the slightest hint of concern for what they might do in response. Harris's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. His chest rose with the weight of his frustration, his need to retaliate, to regain some sense of control. But they both knew the truth. Even now, they were afraid of him. Reynolds took a step forward, his voice dropping lower, edged with the unmistakable promise of retaliation. "You don't get to win this," he muttered, leaning in slightly, his breath hot with frustration. "No matter what happens, we'll make sure you don't walk out of here the same." Jamal didn't move, didn't even acknowledge the words as a threat. His expression remained unreadable, his silence heavier than anything he could have said in response. Then, a new voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." The door to the holding area had swung open once more, and a woman in a sharp gray suit stepped inside, her heels clicking against the tile, her presence an immediate force that neither officer could ignore. Lisa Thompson. Jamal had never met her before, but he recognized the name. Ichu, a civil rights lawyer with a reputation for taking on cases that no one else would touch. A woman who had built her career dismantling police misconduct, a woman who had turned corruption into something she devoured for sport. She barely spared Harris or Reynolds a glance before stepping between them and Jamal's seated form, her posture unwavering, her voice sharp, controlled, unwaveringly authoritative. "I suggest you both leave before I make this worse for you than it already is," Harris scoffed, shaking his head as he took a step back. But Reynolds held his ground, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't know what you're stepping into," he muttered, his voice carrying just the faintest tremor beneath the bravado. Lisa smiled then, a slow, calculated curve of her lips that held no warmth. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm stepping into," she replied, her tone casual but laced with something colder, something dangerous. "I'm stepping into a department that's about to have its entire operation picked apart, piece by piece. I'm stepping into a situation where 2 officers gunned down an unarmed black man in cold blood, then got their teeth kicked in by his father, and now they want to play victim." She took another step forward, closing the space between her and Reynolds, lowering her voice just enough that only he and Harris could hear. "Walk away," she said, not a request, a warning. Reynolds hesitated for just a second too long, then turned sharply, stepping past her and storming out of the room. Harris lingered a moment more, his jaw still tight, his anger still radiating from every inch of him. But he left. The door shut behind them, leaving only Lisa and Jamal in the small cell, the air still thick with unspoken tension. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Lisa turned toward him, her expression shifting from the quiet venom she had reserved for the officers into something more calculated, more professional. She pulled a chair over and sat across from him, crossing one leg over the other as she studied him. "You're in a bad spot," she said finally, her voice even, matter of fact. "They're going to bury you under every charge they can think of. Assault on law enforcement, resisting arrest, inciting violence, probably some ridiculous obstruction charge thrown in just for good measure." Jamal met her gaze, his face unreadable. Lisa exhaled slowly, leaning forward slightly, her elbows resting on her knees. "If we were dealing with just the shooting, there might have been a chance to shift this in your favor, to push for justice, but," she shook her head, "you put 2 cops in the hospital. That changes everything." Jamal's expression didn't shift, but his silence was heavy, deliberate. Lisa studied him for a long moment, then sighed, rubbing a hand across her temple. "Look, I get it," she said, her voice quieter now, the edge fading just slightly. "I do. You had every right to do what you did, but the law doesn't work like that. It doesn't care about what's right. It cares about what it can use against you." She leaned back in her chair, watching him closely. "Right now, they have everything to use against you." Jamal exhaled, his breath slow, measured. He already knew. She didn't have to tell him. But hearing it, having it confirmed by someone who was on his side, by someone who was supposed to fight for him, made it real in a way that settled deep in his bones. The system had failed his son, and now it was coming for him. His jaw clenched, the muscles in his arms tightening, his fingers curling slightly, not in rage, not in defiance, but in the slow, unbearable pressure of something too big for his body to hold. Then, finally, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, edged with something deeper than anger, deeper than sorrow. "I fought for this country," he said, his eyes fixed forward, not on Lisa, not on the cold walls surrounding him, but on something far beyond this cell, something that felt like it was slipping away. "I gave everything to it. Years of my life, my body, my mind. I did things that most people wouldn't survive, things I still carry with me every day." Lisa watched him closely, her expression unreadable, but she didn't interrupt. "I followed orders. I obeyed the law. I was a soldier before I was anything else." He exhaled, slow, controlled, and none of it mattered. Not when they looked at me. Not when they stood outside that house, pointing their guns at me and my son, demanding that we prove we had a right to be there, demanding that we justify our existence before they decided whether or not we deserved to walk away. He swallowed, his throat tightening, his breath catching, just for a moment. And my boy was better than me. He was smarter, kinder. He never picked fights, never raised his voice when he didn't have to. He was going to save people, fix people, help people, and still they looked at him the same way they looked at me, like he was dangerous, like he was something that needed to be put down before they even saw him as a man. His voice didn't shake. It should have, but it didn't, because the sorrow, the unbearable grief, was buried beneath something colder, something harder, something that would not break. Lisa's gaze flickered, her jaw tightening slightly, as if she wanted to say something but knew better than to try. Jamal shook his head, his fingers pressing into his knees. "You say I'm screwed because I fought back, because I didn't let them kill me too, because I broke them the way they deserved to be broken. And maybe you're right. Maybe that's how this ends." He let out a slow breath, the weight of his words settling like stone. "But they've already taken everything from me. What more can they do?" Lisa exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "They can make sure you never walk free again." Jamal turned his head toward her, his expression calm, steady. "What difference does it make?" She stared at him, and for a long moment she had nothing to say. Then her phone buzzed. She didn't react at first, didn't move, as if she hadn't even registered the noise. But then it came again, sharp, insistent. Her brows furrowed slightly as she pulled it from her pocket, glancing at the screen, something in her posture shifting instantly. Her expression tightened. She sat forward, pressing the phone to her ear. "Lisa Thompson." A beat of silence. Then her entire demeanor changed. "What?" Her voice sharpened, her spine straightening, her gaze flickering toward the cell door as if suddenly aware of the world outside again. "Where?" Jamal watched her. Eyes narrowed slightly. Lisa's grip on the phone tightened. "Who posted it?" Another pause. How long ago? Whatever she was hearing, it wasn't good. Or maybe it was. Lisa's breath came a little faster, her free hand clenching at her knee, a flicker of something intense, something urgent, flashing across her face. "And it's spreading?" A longer pause. She let out a slow exhale, her fingers briefly rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Good," she murmured, but there was no relief in her tone, only a new kind of tension, something shifting beneath the surface, something building. She ended the call. Silence. Jamal watched her, waiting. Lisa lowered the phone slowly, her fingers tapping against the back of the device as she finally turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "It's out." He blinked, his voice even. "What's out?" She leaned forward, elbows on her knees, voice lowering. "A doorbell camera caught everything." "The shooting!" The whole thing? Someone uploaded it an hour ago. It's spreading. Jamal didn't move. Lisa studied him, her tone calm but firm. You're not just some guy in a jail cell anymore. Her voice dipped lower, sharper. You're a national headline. A pause. She reached into her bag, pulling out her tablet, swiping quickly before turning the screen toward him. And there it was. The footage, frozen on the first frame, paused before the nightmare unfolded. The officers, Jamal and Darnell standing on the porch. The confrontation, the moment before the world was ripped apart. And then, the headline beneath it. Unarmed black man shot by police. Father beaten and arrested. She let him take it in, watching his face carefully. The protest started 20 minutes ago. Jamal didn't look at her, didn't need to. Because outside these walls, something had already begun. The air inside the station had changed. Jamal could feel it, even from the confines of his cell, where the dim lighting and cold metal bars had become his entire world. The energy outside had shifted, the distant hum of voices growing louder, turning into something more than just the murmurs of an uneasy city. It had become a force, a storm building strength, a tide pulling in fast, unstoppable, relentless. He could hear them now, protesters. Their voices bled through the thick walls of the police station, distant but unmistakable, a chorus of anger, grief, and something else, something sharper, more volatile. A city that had seen too much, a people who had endured too much, a rage that had no more room to be contained. Lisa had been gone for nearly half an hour, called away to deal with the fallout. The moment that video hit the internet, everything had shifted. This wasn't just another case now. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was fuel. The system had done what it always did, but this time, the world had seen it. A new chant carried through the air, rising over the scattered shouts, the slogans, the growing fury. Justice for Darnell! The name, his son's name, echoed through the city, carried by hundreds, maybe thousands, their voices rising, demanding, pressing in. Jamal's eyes remained locked on the wall across from him, his breathing even, his hands resting against his knees, his body still aching. But his mind was clear. The police were cornered now, and they knew it. He could hear it in the way the station moved, the way the footsteps outside the cell block were hasty, uncertain, heavier than before. The officers were no longer moving with the easy arrogance of men who had nothing to lose. They were restless. They were afraid. Then another sound. Not from outside, not from the protesters. This was closer. Raised voices, footsteps approaching the front entrance, the heavy thud of doors opening and closing in quick succession. Someone was leaving the station, and then the shouting from outside changed. It had been angry before, loud, unrelenting, but now it was something else. Something sharper, something that was about to break. Jamal didn't move, didn't shift from where he sat, but he knew. The officers who had killed his son had just stepped outside. The air inside the station had changed. Jamal could feel it, even from the confines of his cell, where the dim lighting and cold metal bars had become his entire world. The energy outside had shifted, the distant hum of voices growing louder, turning into something more than just the murmurs of an uneasy city. It had become a force, a storm building strength, a tide pulling in fast, unstoppable, relentless. He could hear them now. The protesters were right outside. Their voices bled through the thick walls of the police station, distant but unmistakable. A chorus of anger, grief, and something else, something sharper, more volatile. A city that had seen too much, a people who had endured too much, a rage that had no more room to be contained. He could hear the chants louder now. The name, his son's name, being carried by hundreds, maybe thousands, their voices rising, demanding, pressing in. Justice for Darnell! The sound came in waves, rolling over the building, shaking it, reverberating through the very floors beneath him. Outside, the pressure was mounting. Then, the sound of approaching footsteps. Jamal remained still on the bench, his head low, his breathing slow, listening as the familiar voices carried through the quiet corridor beyond his cell. Harris, Reynolds, and a few others. They weren't whispering. They weren't worried. If anything, they sounded almost amused. "This is getting out of hand," Reynolds muttered, his voice low, filled with irritation but not yet concern. "It's a joke," Harris scoffed. "They're loud, but they're not going to do anything. They're out there screaming for justice, but the second we step out, they'll back down. They always do." One of the other officers, a younger one, Jamal could tell from the uncertainty in his voice, shifted. "The crowd's getting bigger," he said. "Command wants us to hold back for now." Harris laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Command can sit on their hands and watch if they want to. We're not letting them block our front door all night." Reynolds exhaled sharply, the sound of his boots shifting against the tile. "We go out there, break it up, show them we're not scared." A pause. "They're waiting for us to look weak. That's what all of this is about." Jamal's fingers curled slightly against his knee. The arrogance, the certainty, the delusion. The protest outside wasn't about them. It was about what they had done, but in their minds, they were still in control. They thought this was just another routine crowd. They thought they could just walk outside, flash their weapons, bark a few threats, and make the world fall in line again. They hadn't learned a thing. Jamal listened as they moved off, their voices fading as they made their way toward the station entrance. They were going out there, and they had no idea what was waiting for them. The protest had swelled to an uncontrollable mass. Bodies pressed together, voices layered over one another, signs raised high, fists clenched. The anger wasn't contained anymore. It was boiling over. And then, the doors of the station opened. The shouting wavered for just a moment as the crowd recognized what was happening. A small team of officers stepped out onto the front steps, their expressions hard, unbothered, prepared to remind the people in front of them who held the power, and leading them, Harris and Reynolds. For a second, they stood tall, their presence a silent challenge, their hands hovering near their belts. Their faces were not ashamed, not remorseful. They still believed they were the ones in control. Then, someone recognized them. It wasn't just a voice this time. It was several. "That's them!" The words cracked through the tension like a thunderclap. A bolt of electricity surging through the crowd all at once. The entire atmosphere changed. Before, there had been shouting. There had been fury. Now, there was movement. A shove in the back. A sign hitting the pavement. A surge forward. "Murderers! You killed him! Get them!" Harris's confidence cracked. His face shifted, his jaw tightening as he registered, too late, what was happening. Reynolds moved first, his posture stiffening, his eyes darting toward the doors behind them. Inside. Now, the officers turned, quickly, hurriedly, their hands twitching toward their weapons but not daring to draw. Not now. Not with all those cameras watching. The first bottle flew, then another. Harris ducked, cursing under his breath. But the crowd was already closing in, the front line pressing forward, the pressure breaking all at once. The officers barely made it back. They shoved their way inside, Harris and Reynolds gasping as they stumbled through the doors, twisting to slam them shut behind them, the heavy metal shaking from the force of the crowd pressing against it. From inside the station, the noise became deafening. The first real crack of glass breaking, the pound of fists against the doors, the roar of people who had finally reached their limit. Jamal heard it all. The distant roar of the crowd turning into something else entirely. The hurried footsteps of officers scrambling through the halls, the clatter of chairs being pushed back, the sudden urgency in voices that had once been so calm, so smug. They were losing control. He sat still, his body battered, his face bruised, his ribs aching, but his mind clear. He could feel it, the shift, the weight of something bigger than him, bigger than this cell, bigger than the system that had tried to break him. Outside, the city was demanding justice. Jamal sat motionless, his hands resting on his knees, his breath slow and steady, listening to the way the station was unraveling. The officers had moved frantically after Harris and Reynolds had barely escaped back inside, their footsteps urgent, their voices clipped and sharp over the radio. But it was too late. The pressure had been building for too long. Then came the sound. Metal groaning, glass breaking, the doors being forced open. The protest had breached the department. A surge of movement filled the halls, a wave of voices crashing against the walls. Protesters flooded in, their footsteps pounding against the tile, their anger now inside the very place that had been built to contain them. Jamal remained still as the footsteps drew closer, until at last his cell door was yanked open. A man, mid-40s, breathless, his hands gripping a baton he must have wrestled from an officer, stood in the doorway, eyes wild with urgency. He wasn't alone. 3 others flanked him, all protesters, all moving with purpose. "Come on!" The man reached for Jamal's arm, trying to pull him up, but Jamal had already begun to rise. His muscles screamed from the beating, but he ignored the pain. The moment his feet hit the ground, he was moving. The station was chaos. Officers scrambled, their once solid formations shattered. Some had fled deeper inside, others still fought to maintain control. The protesters had no real coordination, only raw fury driving them forward. Then, the first tear gas canister hit the floor. A sharp, metallic clunk, followed by the hiss of white smoke. Then another, and another. The room turned to choking mist in seconds. Screams rang out, bodies collided in the thickening cloud, hands clawed at burning eyes, lungs fought against the suffocating air. The station was turning into a trap. Jamal's instincts sharpened. They had to move. Now, through the smoke, he spotted a side hallway leading to a rear exit. The police were still blocking the main entrance, but this way, they had a chance. "This way!" His voice cut through the chaos, firm, commanding, undeniable. People turned, saw him moving, and followed. Jamal pushed forward, the sting of the gas burning through his throat, but he kept his footing. Others coughed, stumbled, fell. He pulled them up, shoved them forward, made sure they kept going. An officer appeared ahead. Too slow. Jamal grabbed the man's vest, yanking him off balance, sending him crashing into the wall. The officer crumpled, groaning, but Jamal was already moving again. The exit door loomed ahead. One last push. They burst through, lungs heaving, bodies staggering, but they were out. The city roared as they emerged. The protest had grown into something massive, something undeniable. The moment Jamal Carter stepped onto the street, bloodied but free, the crowd erupted. Their cheers mixed with chants, voices rising in unison, his name now a battle cry. The world had changed in a single night, and there was no turning back. The moment of triumph was short-lived. Jamal had barely taken in the sight of the massive crowd before the sharp, echoing cracks of gunfire split the night. The cheers turned to screams in an instant. Bodies jerked backward as rubber bullets slammed into flesh, knocking people to the pavement, some clutching their sides, others shielding their heads as the police made their move. The front line of protesters recoiled as officers pushed forward in riot gear, shields raised, batons drawn, the gas still thick in the air behind them. The retreating officers had regrouped, reinforced, and now they were retaliating with full force. Jamal's body tensed, his instincts flared. This was a battlefield now. More shots rang out. Rubber bullets, beanbag rounds, riot control measures meant to hurt, meant to punish, meant to break the spirit of the movement before it could spread too far. But it was too late for that. The movement had already begun. Jamal saw the shift happening in real time. The fear was gone. The police expected people to scatter, to panic, to break ranks and flee. But they didn't. They fought back. Some used the tear gas canisters against them, hurling them back toward the riot line. Others took cover behind overturned barricades, shields made from protest signs. Water bottles, bricks, anything that could be thrown was launched toward the officers who had opened fire. Jamal watched as the front lines clashed, as the tension turned to action, as the streets became a war zone. And then he stepped forward. His voice boomed over the chaos, loud, commanding, cutting through the fear and confusion like a knife. "Stop! Listen to me!" Some turned at the sound of his voice. Not all, not yet, but enough. "They want us to lose control. Don't give them what they want." More heads turned, hands pausing, eyes locking onto him. The people closest to him stilled, their rage momentarily tethered by the presence of the man at the center of it all. Jamal stepped onto a fallen barricade, his posture strong, unshaken, his face bruised but unbowed. "They killed my son. They beat me. They threw me in a cell like I was the criminal." His voice rose, filled with fire, with a grief that had nowhere to go but outward. "And now they think they can shut us up," the crowd responded. A deafening roar of agreement, of fury, of power. Jamal pointed toward the police line. "Look at them. They're afraid. They think their badges protect them from justice." Another surge of voices. More people turned away from the fighting, looking at him, listening. "We will not be silenced." The energy shifted again, not away from action, but toward something more organized, more deliberate. The scattered chaos of the riot was becoming something else, a movement. News cameras had already arrived, recording everything. The world was watching, and Jamal Carter was no longer just a grieving father. He was the voice of something unstoppable. The flashing lights of cameras and news crews had become as much a part of the night as the chanting protesters and the lingering smoke of tear gas. The streets were still restless, the crowd still seething. But in the chaos, a movement was solidifying. The cameras weren't just broadcasting the violence. They were broadcasting the truth. Jamal stood at the center of it, his face bloodied but unbroken, his posture firm, his presence undeniable. Reporters pushed forward, microphones and cameras held out toward him, their voices clashing over one another, each fighting to get the first question in. "Mr. Carter, the country is watching. What are the demands of these protests?" Jamal locked eyes with the reporter who had spoken, his breath slow, deliberate. He wasn't going to let them turn this into a spectacle. He wasn't going to let them water this down into sound bites. This wasn't about politics. This was about his son. "Justice," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. The crowd around him fell into a hush, listening. The reporters leaned in. "For my son. For every life taken by officers who believe their badge makes them untouchable." Another reporter cut in. "What does justice look like? What are the demands?" Jamal didn't hesitate. "Accountability. The two men who murdered my son, Detective Ryan Harris and Officer Jake Reynolds, need to be arrested, charged, and put on trial. No desk duty, no paid suspension, no excuses. They killed my son in cold blood, and they will answer for it." The crowd erupted in agreement. A reporter near the back shouted, "And if that doesn't happen?" Jamal's gaze didn't waver. "Then this city won't stop." The weight of his words hung in the air. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were waiting for the city's response, waiting for the system to prove it was either capable of justice or incapable of anything but cruelty. Hours later, the police responded. The statement came just after midnight. The police chief, Michael Langley, stood behind a podium at the department headquarters, flanked by officers in riot gear. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with exhaustion, his suit wrinkled, but his voice was steady, carrying the same carefully measured indifference that every official statement before him had held. The city waited. The country waited. Then came the words. "At this time, no action is being taken against Detective Harris or Officer Reynolds." A flicker of movement rolled through the press room. Journalists stiffening, murmuring, noting the weight of what had just been said. Langley continued, his expression unreadable. Our department believes these officers were acting in self-defense, in response to a perceived threat. There is an ongoing internal investigation, and we will continue to assess the situation as more details emerge. However, at this moment, we stand by our officers. The words landed like a hammer, and across the city, the dam finally broke. The sun had barely begun to rise when the city erupted. What had started as a protest had become a rebellion. Crowds had doubled, then tripled, spilling into every district, growing louder, angrier, more unrelenting. The word had spread. The demand had been made clear, and the police department had answered with the same familiar indifference that had allowed this to happen in the first place. The people were done asking. Storefronts were smashed, streets blocked, government buildings surrounded. The police were no longer holding the line. They were losing it. And in the center of it all, Jamal Carter stood, watching as the movement he had sparked turned into something unstoppable. This wasn't just about his son anymore. This was about all of them. The city was burning with fury, and Jamal was in the heart of it. The early morning light had done nothing to slow the movement. If anything, the anger had grown overnight, swelling into something the police could no longer contain. The streets, once filled with chants and protest signs, had become a battlefield. Barricades had gone up, makeshift defenses built from overturned cars, broken street signs, anything that could be used to push back against the incoming force of riot police. The air was thick with the acrid sting of tear gas, the rhythmic thud of rubber bullets slamming into bodies, the sharp crack of batons against pavement. The people were pushing forward. The police were holding their line, but the line was beginning to crack. Jamal moved through the chaos with precision, awareness, control. He wasn't just another body in the crowd. He was a soldier, a leader, a man who knew battle and knew how to turn the tide. Then, a new threat emerged. A row of riot police had begun pushing in from the north end of the street, attempting to flank the protesters, trap them between the two advancing formations. Jamal saw it happening before anyone else did. A tactical maneuver, a pincer movement, the kind of strategy used to break formations, to corral and crush resistance. If they didn't stop it now, everyone here would be boxed in, beaten, arrested, maybe worse. His voice cut through the chaos, loud, commanding. "They're flanking! North side! We hold them here!" People turned at the sound of his voice. The hesitation that had existed in the first days of the protest was gone now. They knew him. They trusted him. They followed him. He moved fast, gathering those closest to him, rallying them. "We hold this street! They push! We push back! If they break us here, they take everything!" The words hit hard. People snapped into action. Those with shields, makeshift barriers taken from construction sites, metal signs, even trash can lids, moved to the front. Those with nothing but their bodies stood firm. Then the police came. The first officer swung his baton. Jamal caught the strike, twisting the man's wrist, forcing the weapon free. A second officer lunged. Jamal stepped in, a sharp elbow to the ribs, a precise strike that sent the officer reeling. The front line of protesters collided with the riot police in a brutal clash of bodies, shields, and force. The police pushed. Jamal pushed harder. When an officer grabbed a protester, yanking them toward the police line, Jamal surged forward, his hands locking around the officer's armor, pulling him backward, twisting his balance, sending him crashing onto the pavement. Another officer swung wildly, his baton cutting through the air. Jamal ducked low, came up fast, driving his shoulder into the officer's chest, knocking him off his feet. A protester beside him staggered, caught by a rubber bullet to the leg. Jamal was there, grabbing him, hauling him back before another shot could land. Every movement was calculated, every action deliberate. He wasn't just fighting, he was leading. And then, the riot police hesitated. The line wavered. They had expected an unorganized riot, a panicked crowd, something easy to crush beneath their shields and boots. They hadn't expected Jamal Carter. With one final push, the police were forced back. The flank had failed. The protesters held their ground. And as the riot police regrouped, Jamal stood at the front, unbroken, staring them down, daring them to try again. The city was still burning. But for the first time, the fire was on both sides. The city was theirs now. Jamal stood at the front of the mass of people, his body aching from the fight, his breath still coming hard, but his mind razor-sharp, calculating. The riot police had regrouped, their formation tightening, shields locked together, batons held at the ready, their bodies braced against the wave pressing toward them. But it wasn't enough. The protesters had won this fight, and everyone knew it. Jamal looked around, taking in the sheer scale of the movement that had erupted in the streets. When this began, it had been hundreds, then thousands, now tens of thousands. A force so massive it spilled into side streets, overtook intersections, turned entire city blocks into a breathing, surging demand for justice. And at the heart of it all, one message echoed above everything else. Reynolds and Harris must pay! The chant rippled through the crowd, thousands of voices in unison, growing louder with every step forward. It wasn't just anger anymore. It wasn't just grief. It was something deeper, something unshakable, something that would not stop until the weight of their fury forced a reckoning. Jamal's gaze flicked toward the riot police holding their line. They heard it too, and for the first time, he saw it. Fear. It wasn't on all their faces, not yet, but in some, in the younger officers, in the ones gripping their shields just a little too tight, shifting their weight, their eyes flicking nervously to their commanding officers. It was there. They were outnumbered. They were losing. They had always been the enforcers, the ones in control, the ones who could use force without question, without fear of consequence. But now, they weren't in control anymore, and they knew it. Jamal stepped forward, leading the charge. The police stumbled back, not all at once, not in a full retreat yet, but in small steps, hesitation bleeding into their movements, their resolve faltering under the weight of the sheer number of people pressing against them. "Keep pushing!" Jamal's voice cut through the noise, through the chaos, steady and unwavering. The crowd surged forward. The police gave way. The line cracked. Then it broke. The retreat started as a controlled fallback, an attempt to maintain formation, to make it seem as though they were choosing to reposition. But it wasn't a choice. It was survival. They were being driven back. The streets, once theirs, now belonged to the people. Jamal moved with the crowd, his eyes locked on the officers who were no longer fighting. They were running. Their steps grew faster, more frantic, shields lowered, batons forgotten as they abandoned the streets and fled toward their last stronghold, the police headquarters downtown. Jamal could already see it in his mind. They were going to lock themselves inside, barricade the doors, try to wait this out. But that wouldn't work. Not this time. Not with this many people. The chants grew louder as the protesters advanced, their feet pounding against the pavement, their voices shaking the very walls of the city. Reynolds and Harris must pay! Jamal's eyes flicked toward the windows of buildings along the streets, where more people were watching, recording, documenting every second of this movement. The world was seeing it all, and the police had nowhere left to run. Jamal stood at the front as the wave of people crashed against the police headquarters, their voices a thunderous demand that refused to be ignored. The chants, the sheer weight of their presence, shook the very foundation of the building. The streets were a sea of bodies stretching for blocks in every direction, the air thick with fury, with urgency, with something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years and had now erupted all at once. The police inside had barricaded themselves in. They had retreated behind the steel-reinforced doors, behind bulletproof glass, behind the walls they had always believed would protect them. But tonight, those walls were not enough. The crowd pressed in. The barricades they had set up outside were torn down. Trash cans, traffic cones, anything not bolted to the ground was hurled at the steps. Someone had smashed the spotlights illuminating the entrance, plunging parts of the street into shadow, the only light now coming from the glow of phones recording every second of what was happening. Jamal had seen sieges before, in war, in cities halfway across the world, but he had never imagined he would lead one on his own soil. Still, he did not let the chaos take control. His voice rose above the noise, commanding, firm. "Hold the line!" People turned at the sound of him, waiting for his direction. They wanted justice, but they would not be reckless. Not under his watch. "We do not destroy this building. We do not give them the excuse they want." The rage did not fade, but it was sharpened, focused. They were not a mob. They were a force. Inside, the police could feel it. Through the reinforced glass, Jamal could see them. Some stood rigid, still trying to hold on to their authority, their backs straight, their hands resting on holstered weapons. But others were shaken. Their eyes darted between one another, fingers twitching, their fear barely contained. They had never been on this side before. They had always been the ones pressing forward, the ones in control, the ones the world listened to. But now, they were trapped. Then the doors opened. Not completely, but enough. Enough for a single figure to step out. Police Chief Michael Langley. His suit was disheveled, his tie loosened, his face lined with exhaustion. A man who had spent his entire career being obeyed, now standing before a force that would not kneel. Jamal met his gaze as the chants roared around them, as thousands of voices demanded what Langley had spent the last 24 hours trying to ignore. The chief's shoulders rose with a deep breath, his lips pressing into a thin line before he finally spoke. "I want to speak with Jamal Carter." The crowd exploded, voices clashing all at once, some demanding action, others calling him a coward for waiting this long. But Jamal lifted a hand, steady, controlled, silencing them. Langley's face was unreadable, but his posture told the truth. He had lost. Jamal didn't move for a long moment, letting the weight of it settle, letting the chief feel exactly what it meant to be the one who had to beg for an agreement. Then, finally, he stepped forward. "Let's talk." The police chief led Jamal inside, the heavy doors of the headquarters closing behind them, shutting out the roar of the crowd. The air inside was thick, a mixture of sweat, tension, and the unspoken realization that the world had shifted in a way that no one in this building had ever expected. Jamal walked with deliberate steps, unshaken, unbowed, his presence no longer that of a man who had been beaten down and thrown behind bars, but of a leader, of a force that could not be denied. The conference room was dimly lit, its long tables scattered with abandoned coffee cups, crumpled notes, the remnants of a department in full crisis mode. Several high-ranking officers stood along the walls, their faces unreadable, too disciplined to show fear outright, but it was there, sitting beneath their hardened expressions. Langley took his seat at the head of the table. Jamal didn't sit. The chief exhaled slowly, his face lined with exhaustion, with the weight of what this night had done to him. For the first time since the protests began, he wasn't the one dictating the terms. "You want justice," Langley began, his voice even, though there was an edge of weariness beneath it. "We both know there are things I can and cannot control." Jamal's gaze remained unwavering. "What you can control," he said, his voice steady, "is what happens to the men who murdered my son." The words landed like a blow, undeniable, unmovable. Langley leaned forward, his fingers lacing together on the table, his shoulders tightening. "The department is willing to give you what you're asking for." The room was silent. The only sound was the distant, muffled roar of the crowd outside. "Reynolds and Harris," Langley continued, his voice level, careful. "They're done. Fully terminated. Effective immediately." Jamal didn't react, but he could feel the shift in the air, the first crack in the fortress the department had built around itself. Langley exhaled, his tone still measured but losing its practiced authority. "We won't protect them. They're out. You have my word." Jamal's jaw clenched slightly, but he remained stone-faced. "Your word," he repeated, letting the words sit between them. Langley swallowed, as if fully realizing his word meant nothing here. "I'll announce it publicly. They'll be gone before the sun sets tomorrow." Jamal tilted his head slightly. "And?" Langley hesitated. "Just for a moment." Then he nodded. "I resign." The officers along the walls shifted, glancing at one another, the weight of the moment settling over them. Some had likely seen this coming. Others had hoped it wouldn't come to this. "I'll make my statement in the morning," Langley continued, "effective immediately. I step down. No ceremony. No speeches. I'm done." Jamal let the words settle. There was still one more thing. "Me and the protesters." Langley sighed, his head bowing slightly as if he had known this was coming. "No charges." Jamal watched him closely. "None," Langley repeated, firmer this time. "No arrests. No retaliation. The department walks away from this. And so do all of you." For the first time, Jamal let the weight of the moment sink in. Langley sat back in his chair, his gaze tired, resigned. "This stops here. The protests end. The city moves forward." Jamal exhaled slowly, controlled, steady. Then, his eyes flicked to the side, to the far end of the room, where two men sat in silence, Reynolds and Harris. The two officers sat across the room, their postures stiff, their faces tense. Their uniforms were still on, but their badges were gone, stripped from them before this meeting even began. Jamal took his time, stepping toward them, letting the air between them thicken, letting them feel every ounce of what he had carried since the moment they pulled the trigger. Neither man met his eyes at first. Not until he was close enough to reach them. Close enough that if he wanted to, he could have ended them right there. "Look at me!" Harris flinched, just barely. Reynolds clenched his jaw, his gaze finally rising, his expression forced into something neutral, something that was supposed to hold firm. But Jamal saw through it. "You don't have your guns now. You don't have your badges. You don't have anything protecting you." His voice was low, steady, cutting. Reynolds exhaled sharply, like he wanted to say something, but Jamal wasn't finished. "You thought this would go away. You thought you'd say the right words, let the department handle it, hide behind your reports. You thought you'd be back at work in a few weeks, maybe a few months. You thought this city would forget." His voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. "But I won't forget." He took a slow step forward, the room holding its breath. "And I will not stop until you are exactly where you belong." Reynolds swallowed, shifting in his chair, his bravado starting to crack. Harris wasn't much better, his hands twitching slightly, his shoulders too tight, his breath uneven. "You killed my son. You murdered him while he was on his knees, trying to explain why he was there. And then, when I held him in my arms, when I begged you to step back, you put your hands on me like I was the criminal." He leaned in, just enough for them to feel the weight of every word. "I should have ended you both where you stood." Neither man breathed. "But I won't." A long pause. "Because I want you to live long enough to see yourselves in cuffs. I want you to wake up every day knowing that I am coming for you, that I will fight to see you behind bars, that your names will never mean anything except what they are now. The names of murderers." Harris's breath hitched. Reynolds looked away. "I am going to bury you both in the only place you belong." Neither of them had a response, because there was nothing left to say. Jamal straightened, his shoulders back, his stance firm, before finally turning his back on them. He walked away without looking back. The war was not over, but it had just turned in his favor. The doors of the police headquarters swung open, and Jamal stepped out. The night air was thick, electric, humming with tension as thousands of eyes locked onto him, waiting. The crowd, which had once been a boiling storm of anger and grief, now stood on the edge of something else. They had come expecting another battle, another round of resistance, another moment where the system would refuse to bend. Instead, they got this. The silence held for only a moment. Then, Jamal raised his hand. A hush rippled through the crowd. He let the weight of the moment settle before he spoke, his voice steady, controlled, carrying across the sea of people. "It's done." The words crashed over them like a tidal wave. "Reynolds and Harris have been fired. They are no longer police officers. They are nothing." A roar of approval surged forward, bodies pressing in, voices shouting in triumph, in rage, in long-awaited justice. Jamal didn't stop. "Langley is stepping down. He will not lead this department another day. He's running because he knows what he let happen. He knows what he covered up. And he knows that he motioned to the mass of people, to all of them. We're never going to let this go." The cheers swelled, rolling through the streets, the sound stretching for blocks. "And the protests," he continued, his voice cutting through the celebration, grounding it, pulling their focus back to what mattered most, "are not over." The celebration dipped for only a second, the crowd bracing, waiting. "Not until these men are in cuffs. Not until we see them where they belong." The cheering turned into something else. A war cry. The people had won a battle tonight, but the war wasn't over. Jamal felt it in the air, in the strength of their voices, in the certainty in their faces. This was no longer just about him. This was bigger than Darnell, bigger than any one person. They will stand trial. They will face the people. They will answer for what they've done. And with those words, the movement solidified into something unbreakable. Jamal lifted his fist. The city roared. The next day, Jamal sat across from Lisa in a small office, a temporary legal space set up by activists and supporters. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't polished, but it was filled with people working tirelessly, researching, making calls, preparing documents. Lisa had already spread a stack of case files across the table, her sharp eyes scanning every page, with the kind of focus that only came from years of fighting battles in courtrooms just like this one. "The DA's office is still feeling the heat," she said, flipping through another document. "Public pressure is forcing them to act, but don't expect them to be on our side. They'll take this case because they have to, not because they want to." Jamal exhaled slowly, his fingers interlocked as he leaned forward, his gaze steady. "So what's the strategy?" Lisa smirked slightly, the kind of expression that told him she had already thought 10 steps ahead. "We go for murder. Full stop. No manslaughter, no lesser charges. We push for the harshest sentence possible. And we make sure the jury sees exactly what happened." She reached over and tapped the printout of the doorbell footage. The single image of Reynolds and Harris standing with their guns raised, moments before they fired. "This is our key. The world has already seen it, but the jury needs to feel it." Jamal nodded, his jaw tightening. "And if they try to twist it?" Lisa leaned back, folding her arms. "Then we twist it back. We don't let them paint you as the aggressor. We don't let them call what happened a mistake. And we make sure that when those two men walk into that courtroom, they know they are the ones on trial. Not you, not Darnell, not this movement." Jamal let the weight of it settle. He had been fighting since the moment his son was killed, but now the fight was shifting. It wasn't about fists or shields anymore. It was about the law, about forcing a system that had never worked for them to do the one thing it had always refused to do: hold its own accountable. Lisa slid another file toward him. "We go over everything, every testimony, every angle of that footage. We prepare for every lie they'll try to sell." Jamal nodded. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about making sure they never did this to another family again. The days following the police chief's resignation were a storm of movement, strategy, and constant pressure. The protests had not disappeared, nor had they lost momentum. They had simply shifted in purpose. What had once been a city rising in anger was now a city standing in expectation. The people had won the first battle, but the real war was about to begin. Jamal spent nearly every waking hour inside the makeshift legal office, poring over files, reviewing footage, preparing for a courtroom fight that would be unlike anything he had faced before. The streets outside still pulsed with energy, crowds still gathering, still chanting Darnell's name, still demanding that Reynolds and Harris face the consequences that had been denied to too many before them. Lisa stood at the center of the legal team, ruthless in her precision, tireless in her focus. Every document that crossed her desk was marked with notes, counterpoints, strategies that anticipated the defense's every possible move. The legal team worked around the clock, turning the weight of public outrage into something undeniable, something the courts could not ignore. But even with all the pressure, they still had a fight ahead of them. The justice system, despite the overwhelming evidence, was already dragging its feet. Meetings with the district attorney's office were tense, their reluctance bleeding through in every carefully worded statement. The DA, a middle-aged man named Gregory Holden, had already tried to keep things vague in the first meeting, offering promises of a fair and thorough investigation without committing to any specific charges. Jamal had seen it before. This wasn't hesitation. It was avoidance. Lisa, seated next to him, didn't give them the chance to stall. The charges will be murder. Nothing less. Holden had sighed then, rubbing his temple like this was a headache instead of a fight for justice. We have to consider all aspects before. Lisa had leaned forward, cutting him off with a measured, lethal sharpness. Consider this. If you drag this out, if you try to soften the charges, if you treat this like it's anything less than cold-blooded murder, the people outside will know exactly what's happening. She pointed toward the window, where the distant hum of protesters still carried through the walls. You think the city was angry before? Try letting those men walk free and see what happens. Holden had shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie, realizing that this wasn't just another case that would fade into the system's backlog. It was a case that could define his career, a case the world was watching. As the case moved forward, Jamal became more than just a grieving father. He was the movement's anchor, the man every camera wanted to hear from, the name every reporter wanted in their headline. He had never asked to be in this position, but now that he was here, he refused to back down. Every interview, every statement, every speech he gave was measured, deliberate, unshakable. He didn't rage. He didn't give them the image they wanted, the image of an angry black man that the media had used for decades to discredit those who demanded justice. Instead, he spoke with precision, with weight, with the unwavering resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose, but everything left to fight for. At a press conference outside City Hall, a reporter had asked him if he believed the system would actually convict the men who killed his son. Jamal had stared into the cameras, his expression calm but unrelenting. If the system works, they'll be convicted. If it doesn't, then we'll all know what we've always known, that it was never built to protect us. The clip had gone viral within hours. The weight of his words settled into the country's conscience. It didn't take long for the lawyers representing Reynolds and Harris to begin their counterattack. Their strategy was predictable. They feared for their lives. They believed they were stopping a crime. They followed protocol. They used every excuse that had let officers before them walk free. But this time, they were fighting an uphill battle. The footage from the doorbell camera had already destroyed their defense before they could even mount it. It showed everything. The moment they arrived, the moment they demanded submission, the moment Darnell reached for his phone, the moment they opened fire. It showed Jamal cradling his dying son, his face twisted in agony, his body frozen in a moment of irreversible grief. It was undeniable. But still, the defense tried. They needed to muddy the waters, to plant doubt, and so they attacked Jamal. They called him violent. They pointed to his background, his military history, the fight in the street after his son was killed. They tried to make him the aggressor, tried to make it seem as if the officers were right to see him as dangerous. Lisa had expected it. "They'll put you on trial just as much as their clients," she warned him, pacing the legal office, scanning the latest defense statements being leaked to the press. "They'll try to make you the problem." Jamal had only nodded. Let them try, because this time, the world had already seen the truth. And no amount of spin, no legal maneuvering, no desperate attempt to twist reality could erase what had been caught on camera. The night before the trial, Jamal stood in the doorway of the office, staring out at the city that had become a battleground and a beacon all at once. The protests still carried on, the chants still ringing through the streets, the murals of Darnell painted across walls that would never forget his name. Lisa stood beside him, her expression unreadable, but knowing. "This is it," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Jamal nodded, his fists tightening at his sides. "Yeah," Lisa exhaled, looking out at the restless city. "You ready?" Jamal didn't answer at first, because this wasn't about being ready. It was about making sure they never had to do this again. He turned to her, his voice steady. "We don't lose." Lisa smirked slightly, her confidence matching his own. "Then let's go win." The trial was set to begin in the morning, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every aisle lined with reporters, activists, and citizens who had followed this case from the moment Darnell Carter took his last breath on that sidewalk. The weight of the moment pressed against the walls, thick with anticipation, with expectation, with a tension that had not lessened in the weeks since the protests had taken hold of the city. Jamal sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture straight, his hands folded together, his face unreadable. This wasn't the battlefield he had trained for, but it was one he had prepared himself to fight. On the other side of the room, Harris and Reynolds sat stiffly, their suits pressed, their expressions carefully neutral, but their shoulders told the truth. They were bracing. They were afraid. The judge entered, the room rising, the shuffle of fabric, the clicking of cameras snapping their first images of the trial's opening moments. And then it began. The defense called Jake Reynolds first. He moved like a man who had spent weeks rehearsing his words, his hands clenched in his lap, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering toward the jury as if scanning for the ones who might be sympathetic. He tried to appear composed, but his voice carried the weight of something forced, something unnatural. "I feared for my life that night," Reynolds said, his words slow, measured. "We had received a call about a possible break-in. It was dark. We saw two men. One of them, a large, imposing man, was acting hostile. He refused to comply. He wouldn't get on his knees. He hesitated just for a second, just enough time for Lisa to cut in. "And which one of them was the large, imposing man?" Reynolds licked his lips. "Jamal Carter." Lisa nodded, barely masking her disdain. "And Darnell Carter?" He complied. "Correct?" He was on his knees, hands behind his head. A pause, a hesitation. "Yes, but you still shot him." Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. He reached for something. "I thought it was a weapon. We had to react fast. It was dark. And did you see a weapon?" Lisa asked, her voice cold, cutting through the excuses like a blade. Reynolds exhaled slowly. "No." "Did he have a weapon?" "No." "So you shot an unarmed man who was on his knees." "I thought." "You thought? Or you panicked?" Lisa stepped forward, her presence suffocating. "Because that's what this is, isn't it? You didn't assess the situation. You didn't confirm a threat. You fired. And you killed an innocent man." Reynolds swallowed hard, his face pale, his carefully crafted mask beginning to crack. Lisa stepped back, letting the silence stretch, letting the jury absorb the admission that had just slipped past his lips. Ryan Harris was less polished. Where Reynolds had tried to appear in control, Harris was stiff, visibly uncomfortable, his hands gripping the edge of the stand as if it might anchor him against the pressure in the room. "I did my job," he started, his voice hollow, as if saying the words would make them true. The moment was tense. Carter was resisting. His son reached for something. It all happened fast. Lisa let him talk, let him spill out every excuse, every justification, until he started contradicting himself. You said Jamal Carter was resisting. Did he ever strike you? Did he ever reach for a weapon? Harris hesitated. No, but he was aggressive. Aggressive? How? He was standing still, arguing his rights. Is that aggression? Or is that a man protecting his family? Harris blinked, shifting in his seat. Lisa didn't let him answer. You killed an innocent man, and then, after you shot him, you tackled his father to the ground. Why? He had just watched his son die. He was unarmed. He was a threat. Lisa's eyebrows lifted. A grieving father was a threat? Harris's jaw tensed. I did my job. Lisa turned to the jury, nodding slightly, as if letting them see the truth for themselves. Harris's words meant nothing. His actions had already spoken for him. The courtroom felt heavier when Jamal walked toward the stand. Every step slow, deliberate, the weight of the last few months pressing against his shoulders. When he sat down, he didn't look at Reynolds or Harris. He didn't need to. Lisa approached. Tell us about that night. Jamal exhaled, his voice quiet at first, but steady. It was supposed to be a celebration. The words hung in the air. My son had just graduated medical school. We rented a house, just for a few days, to relax, to breathe. He had worked his entire life to get to that moment. He was going to save lives. Jamal swallowed, his hands tightening slightly on the edge of the witness stand. And then they showed up. He motioned toward the defendants. Neither of them could look at him. We told them why we were there. We explained it. My son did everything they told him to do. He got on his knees. He put his hands behind his head. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He let the silence settle, but they still shot him. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jamal's voice remained calm, but filled with an ache that could never be erased. I held him while he died. I heard his last words. I felt the life leave him. And when I begged them to stop, they threw me to the ground. He turned toward the jury. And if that footage didn't exist, if you never saw what happened with your own eyes, they'd be free right now. Lisa let his words sit in the silence. Jamal didn't blink, didn't waver. They didn't see my son that night. They didn't see a man or a doctor or someone who had done everything right. They saw something they were afraid of, something they thought they had the right to kill. His eyes flicked to Reynolds and Harris. And now, they're afraid. Neither man moved. Jamal turned back to the jury, but this time, they don't get to walk away. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Lisa stepped forward, her voice softer now. No further questions. The trial wasn't over, but the truth had been spoken. The air inside the courtroom had changed. It was no longer filled with the voices of attorneys arguing their cases, no longer echoing with cross-examinations or the defensive justifications of men who had already lost their grip on the narrative. The trial had run its course. Every testimony given, every piece of evidence laid bare before the jury, every argument exhausted. Now, there was only waiting. Jamal sat in the front row, his hands clasped together, his back straight, his face unreadable. This was the moment everything had built toward, the moment that would decide whether the system, for once, would do what it had never done before: hold men like Harris and Reynolds accountable. The courtroom doors opened, and the bailiff's voice rang through the silence. All rise. The judge stepped in first, her expression carefully neutral, followed by the 12 jurors who had spent days deliberating over what the world had already seen with its own eyes. Their faces gave nothing away, their postures stiff, their movements slow, the weight of their decision sitting heavily on their shoulders. The entire room remained on edge as they filed into their seats, the tension thick enough to smother the very air itself. Jamal barely breathed. The officers sat just feet away, their bodies still, their gazes flickering with something they had tried to hide through every moment of this trial: fear. Not the false fear they had spoken about on the witness stand, not the fear they claimed to have felt when they opened fire on his son. No, this was real fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of consequences. Fear of finally facing something they had never had to face before. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, an older man with a solemn face, nodded once. We have, Your Honor. The courtroom held its collective breath. The judge gave a small nod before turning toward the defendants, her voice steady, calm, unwavering. Will the defendants please rise? The creaking of chairs, the shuffle of fabric, the sound of feet moving against polished wood. Reynolds and Harris stood. Jamal's fingers curled into his palms, his breath steady but slow, his chest rising and falling in measured control. This was it. The judge turned back to the jury. On the charge of second-degree murder in the death of Darnell Carter, how do you find the defendant? Officer Jake Reynolds. The pause stretched. Jamal could hear nothing except the beating of his own heart. Then, the words that changed everything. Guilty. The room shifted all at once, the energy rippling through every person present, as if the very foundation of the system had cracked under the weight of that single word. Guilty. A shuddering breath left Jamal's chest, but still he did not move. The judge continued. On the charge of second-degree murder in the death of Darnell Carter, how do you find the defendant? Officer Ryan Harris. The second pause felt even longer than the first. Guilty. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, hushed exclamations, voices breaking through the thick silence, emotion rippling through the space like an earthquake that could no longer be contained. Justice had spoken, and it had not hesitated. Jamal exhaled slowly, the weight of something he had carried for too long pressing down on him, not with the crushing force of grief, but with the strange, unfamiliar sensation of release. He blinked, once, twice, feeling the heat behind his eyes but refusing to let it fall. His hands unclenching, his muscles still tense, even as his mind whispered the truth that had just been spoken aloud. They were guilty. Harris staggered slightly, as if the force of the word had struck him physically, as if, for the first time, he was beginning to understand what it truly meant. Reynolds's face had gone pale, his jaw clenching, his hands shaking as he stared forward, his world shattering around him. They had spent their entire careers believing they were untouchable. Now they would face what they had tried to avoid. The judge lifted the sentencing report before her, flipping through the pages slowly, methodically, the entire room silent as she prepared to deliver what had once seemed impossible. When she finally spoke, her voice carried through the room like the final gavel strike of history itself. For the crime of second-degree murder, this court hereby sentences Jake Reynolds to 25 years to life in federal prison. Reynolds visibly tensed, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as his world fell apart in real time. The judge turned next to Harris. For the crime of second-degree murder, this court hereby sentences Ryan Harris to 25 years to life in federal prison. Harris's breath hitched. Both sentences will be served without the possibility of parole. Jamal's eyes closed for a fraction of a second. Not in relief, not in celebration, just to absorb the weight of it, the weight of something that had never happened before, something that had never been done for men like him, for families like his. Justice had not whispered. It had roared. A sound broke the silence. The quiet, almost choked gasp from Reynolds, his head shaking slightly, his body finally betraying what his mind refused to accept. The bailiffs moved in. For the first time, Harris and Reynolds felt what it meant to be on the other side of the law, what it meant to have hands gripping their arms, forcing them forward, what it meant to have the cold bite of steel lock around their wrists. Jamal watched, his expression unreadable, as the men who had torn his life apart were led out of the courtroom, shackled, powerless, stripped of everything they once wielded with reckless ease. For a long time, he did not move. Lisa placed a hand on his shoulder, a firm but steady weight, her voice quiet but strong. "It's over." Jamal blinked again. his fingers flexing slightly, his breath deep but slow. No, he thought, it wasn't over. Darnell was still gone. His son, his boy, the child he had held in his arms, the young man he had been so proud of, the life that had been stolen so brutally, he wasn't coming back. But something had happened here. Something the world had never expected. Something that had felt impossible. For once, the system had bent. For once, it had done what it was supposed to do. For once, men like Reynolds and Harris did not walk free. Jamal closed his eyes briefly, just for a moment. Then he rose to his feet, turning toward the doors, stepping toward the future, toward the world that was forever changed. The courtroom doors opened, and outside, the people were waiting. The roar of the crowd crashed against him like a wave, not in anger, not in unrest, but in relief, in triumph, in something that had never been given to them before. Proof that justice, real justice, was possible. Thousands filled the streets, packed into every inch of space, their faces lifted, their fists raised, their voices chanting not in grief this time, not in sorrow, but in victory. Jamal stood at the top of the courthouse steps, his breath slow, his chest rising and falling in a way that felt foreign. The weight of everything, the fight, the loss, the months of pushing against a system that had always been immovable, it was all still there. It wasn't gone. It would never be gone. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a weight he was carrying alone. He had fought, and the world had fought with him. The people reached for him, their voices merging into a chorus of emotions, of stories, of wounds that had been carried for too long without healing. Some called his name, their faces streaked with tears, their hands grasping for even a moment to stand beside him, to tell him what this meant. Others stood in silence, their hands on their hearts, their eyes speaking for them. And then they came to him, not reporters, not cameras, the people, the ones who had been waiting for this their whole lives. An elderly woman stepped forward first, her hands trembling as she reached for him. Her eyes, dark and worn with time, held stories he did not know but somehow understood. "I lost my son to them 40 years ago," she whispered, her voice shaking but strong. "They told me the same lies. They let them walk free. I prayed I'd live long enough to see this day." Jamal took her hands, squeezing them gently. She had waited decades for what had taken him only months to see. Another man came next, younger, his face weary, his grip firm when he clasped Jamal's shoulder. "They killed my cousin last year," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They never even saw the inside of a courtroom. Watching you fight, seeing you win, it gave me something I thought I'd never have. It gave me closure." Jamal exhaled slowly, his chest tight, his throat thick with something he couldn't name. The faces kept coming, the voices, the stories. "My brother never got justice. But today, I feel like he finally can rest. They took my father when I was 5. No trial, no charges, just gone. But this was for him too. You didn't just fight for Darnell. You fought for all of us." The words hit him like a force, like a weight he hadn't expected. He had been so focused on his own loss, on his own grief, on his own fight, that he had never stopped to fully understand what this meant for everyone else. Darnell wasn't the first, and he had always feared he wouldn't be the last. But now, maybe things were different. The protests had begun as something fueled by pain, by anger, by a demand for something that had never been given. But now, as Jamal stood on those courthouse steps, looking out at the people who had fought beside him, at the ones who had lost and never been heard, at the ones who had waited their entire lives for this moment, he could feel it shifting. The energy was still there. The fire had not burned out. But something had eased. Something had settled. The protests had not been silenced, but they had found what they had been searching for. For the first time, they had been heard. Jamal lifted his gaze, looking past the crowd, past the courthouse, past the skyline of a city that had been forced to confront itself. This was not the end. There would still be more fights, more names to remember, more justice to demand. But today, they had won. And that victory belonged to every single person who had ever stood in these streets, shouting the names of the lost, refusing to be ignored. Jamal exhaled, turning to Lisa, whose expression was unreadable but knowing. "What now?" she asked, her voice steady. Jamal's fingers flexed slightly at his sides, his breath slow, controlled. "Now, I'm going to visit my son." The cemetery was quiet. The world had moved on. The city had exhaled. The streets had emptied. The protests had eased into something quieter, something steadier. But here, in this place, nothing had changed. The wind still moved through the trees the same way it always had. The sky was the same gray-blue it had been on the day they buried him. The stone was still cold beneath Jamal's hand as he traced the letters carved into it, his fingertips running over the name that felt so familiar and so wrong all at once. Darnell Carter, 1997, 2024. He swallowed, pressing his lips together, his throat tight. "Hey, kid." His voice came quiet, steady, but thick with something heavy. "I should have been here sooner." The words sat between them, unanswered, because they would always be unanswered. He let out a slow breath, his fingers flexing against his knee as he crouched beside the grave, his other hand still resting against the smooth stone. "I don't even know where to start. I guess I could tell you that we won." He let out a quiet, breathless chuckle, shaking his head. "You should have seen it, son. The way they ran, the way the city stood up. We pushed them back, made them listen." His voice wavered slightly, but he kept going. "They're in prison now, the ones who took you from me. Life, no parole. They'll never walk free again." "The people," he exhaled sharply, shaking his head, like the weight of it still hadn't fully settled. "The people wouldn't let them. They carried you, Darnell. I carried you, but so did all of them. The whole damn world saw you." Jamal let the silence stretch, his breath slow, measured, controlled. "But none of that changes that I lost you," he murmured. "None of it brings you back." He sat back slightly, his hands resting against his knees, his eyes never leaving the headstone. "You know, I keep thinking about that night," he admitted, his voice softer now. "The way you looked when you got your diploma. You were so damn happy, kid. I've never seen you smile like that before." A pause. "I don't even think I told you how proud I was. Not enough, anyway. Not the way I should have." His fingers curled into fists for a moment, but he forced himself to relax. "You were gonna change the world, son." His throat tightened. "But maybe you still did." The wind moved through the trees, rustling the leaves, filling the space between his words, between the things he could never say, between the moments that had been stolen. He exhaled, shaking his head, his hands moving to pull something from his jacket. The gift, the same one he had given Darnell that night, wrapped and perfect. The same one he had found when he packed up the things from the rental house, still untouched, still unopened. He let it sit between his palms for a long moment before setting it gently against the stone. "You never got the chance to open this," he murmured. "I thought maybe now was the right time." His fingers pulled at the edges of the paper, slow, deliberate. The wrapping peeled away, revealing a leather-bound book, the edges worn slightly, as if it had been passed down through years of hands before ever reaching this moment. Jamal swallowed hard as he ran his fingers over the cover. "Notes from Mom." His breath caught. "You probably didn't even remember I had this," he murmured. "Your mother started it before you were born. She used to write in it at night, little things she wanted you to know, things she thought she might not be able to tell you one day. After she passed, I kept writing in it. I was going to give it to you when you left for college, but I wasn't ready. And then I thought maybe when you graduated, when you became the man she always knew you would be." His hands tightened around the book. "I guess I waited too damn long." For the first time, his voice cracked. Jamal exhaled slowly, his fingers gripping the book, his head bowing slightly, letting himself feel it. Just for a moment. Then, carefully, he set it down, pressing it lightly against the headstone, his fingers lingering over it before finally pulling away. "It's yours now, kid," he said, his voice quieter, just like it always was. He sat there for a long time, his eyes never leaving the book, his heart heavy with the weight of all the things left unsaid, all the time that had slipped through his fingers. Then, finally, he rose. The sky was darker now, the wind cooler against his skin, the weight on his chest still there but somehow lighter. He looked down at the grave one last time, his jaw tight, his breath slow. "Rest easy, son," he murmured, and then he walked away. Not leaving Darnell behind, but carrying him forward. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.